All right. Thank you, JL. Appreciate you reading for us. Uh, Today, I want to talk about the greatest nervous breakdown in history. You know, we have a tendency to think that all illness must come from the devil, all problems must come from sin. And in the indirect way, this one's no different than the others, but Daniel chapter 4 records the greatest nervous breakdown in history. I had JL read the first half of the chapter. It's just not enough time to read it all. But we'd like to talk about it today. Now, Father, help us. Lord, I don't want to malign and I don't want to build bigger than he is, Nebuchadnezzar. Lord, you know what you did in his heart and you know where he is today. Father, you've given us a lesson here that helps us to understand how you think and how we ought to think about ourselves. You said in another place, let no more man think more highly of himself than he ought. Father, I hear people talk about, well, you need to learn to love yourself. And I can't find that in your word. I think, Lord, that too much we love ourselves. And instead of loving ourselves, we ought to be loving you and we ought to be loving others. We ought to let the loving of ourselves to you. Father, would you help us to understand your word today? And I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest monarch that ever lived on the earth. He was greatest because he was an absolute king of the highest order. An absolute king, his word is the law. When Judah went into captivity, God said to Daniel, I'm going to set up 4 kingdoms that will rule the earth until Jesus comes. The first one is going to be Babylon. He'll be symbolized as gold. The second will be Medo-Persia. It will be symbolized as silver. The third will be brass. That'll be Alexander the Great. And the fourth will be the kingdom of the Antichrist. And they will rule until the Son of God comes back to break it down and to take over the government of mankind. Nebuchadnezzar, being the first, was an absolute dictator. The Chaldeans were a small group of people. The Babylonian people themselves descended from Noah's son, Ham. They were Hamites. The Chaldeans came down from Shem and were related to the Jews through Shem, but a completely different ethnic group of people. The Chaldeans were a minority, but they were an intellectual control group. They were practicers of the dark arts. The Chaldeans and Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, were the developers of the first organized mythological pantheon, the first group of gods that ruled the earth, the first that would compete for God. Now, Babylon throughout history is always the rival of Jerusalem. Yep, they were, HL, and then when they conquered Lebanon, the Phoenician ships carried that religion to the 4 corners of the earth, and then each of those countries where the Phoenicians landed took the Babylonian myths and worked them into their own. I think yesterday they were talking about the first Jupiter. We're talking about Marduk or Bel of Babylon carried over to Rome and got a couple local characteristics, and so we see him as a different god, but he really is the same one. Babylon, the rival of Jerusalem, not the equal, the rival. And throughout history, it has been trying to control the world. When Cyrus the Great captured Babylon, he placed his capital there. When Alexander the Great captured Babylon, he placed his capital there. No Roman Caesar ever placed his capital at Babylon. And that's why I believe the Antichrist will be the first king of Rome, the heir of Greece, etc., and he will in fact place his capital in Babylon. He'll have a religious capital in Jerusalem. He'll have a political capital in Rome, but he'll have his actual residence in the city of Babylon. We could do that. We could take the time another time to look at that. We won't today. Because he's the king of the earth, by God's design, he addresses this letter to every group of people in the world. And he said, I need you to know what the real God has done in my life. No matter where you live, we have scattered our error and our falsehood to the ends of the earth. I want to tell you now, we were wrong. I want to tell you about the true God. Now, in his day, the population of the world was probably a few million. So it was easy to be able to reach all the centers of population in the world. And he begins to tell about how great things were. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't always that way. He was a devout follower. His name, Nebo. Nebo is one of the Babylonian gods. And I forget what Nebuchadnezzar means. It doesn't really matter that much right now. But he was named for his god. But then he captured a city named Jerusalem, and he brought back a young boy named Daniel, and decided he would make Daniel into a Babylonian. He would teach him all the occult arts, and he would show him how to mystically dominate the Jewish people and then send him back to rule. That was the way Babylon usually ruled its people. But old Daniel vowed that he would not defile himself with the king's wine and with his meat. And Daniel refused to cooperate, and yet God, according to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 20, Daniel and his 3 friends were 10 times smarter than anybody else in the group of captives. Nebuchadnezzar noticed that. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream in his 2nd year. Daniel wasn't more than a year or 2 older than he had been in the first. You know the drill. He wouldn't tell the dream. You interpret it. I'm going to kill every one of you if you can't interpret the dream. Nebuchadnezzar knew that he was a fraud. And so he was challenging all of the Chaldeans, all of the occultists, the astrologers, the magicians, all of them. Are you any greater than I am? If you're not, I'm going to cut your head off. The soldiers came around to take Daniel. Daniel said, what's happening here? They said, well, didn't you hear? No, I didn't hear. Well, if you can't interpret the king's dream, he's going to kill you. Daniel said, give me a day and I'll interpret it. Well, when he got done doing it, Nebuchadnezzar said, the king answered Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods. God's starting to move up in his pantheon. And a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. In chapter 3, the 3 Hebrew children, they wouldn't bend, budge, or burn. We'll talk about them another day. But when he brought them out the fire, he said, therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there's no other God that can deliver after this sort. And God had moved up in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. Now we're in chapter 4. And Nebuchadnezzar starts the chapter. This is his personal testimony of how he got saved, to be honest with you. Nebuchadnezzar said, I want you to know what God has done in my life. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. You would notice that that's a parallelism. We talked about that in Psalm 1. My house, my palace, same building, just different look at it. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head Notice how the King James translators tried to bring the poetry of the moment into English. The thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head, perfect poetry, troubled me. I looked at 4 other translations of the Bible. They didn't carry the poetic sense of it. Not that that's a bad thing, I just think it's an interesting idiosyncrasy. Therefore made I a decree to bring all the wise men of Babylon. He said, I did it again. I wanted to know who could help me. In Daniel chapter 2, it was a test of the wise men. This time, I have a dream that won't let me go, and I don't understand it. And they brought in all the different dream interpreters in the land of Babylon. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, I do not believe in interpreting dreams. That may offend some of you. I think if you dream something bad, it's probably because you had pizza too late and were having indigestion. You say, are you telling me that God cannot give dreams? He could, but I believe once he finished his word that God was done revealing directly to mankind any kind of new truth. But in Daniel's case, Nebuchadnezzar was used to dreams. He was into that occult whole business. And so he expected it. And God surprised him by letting Daniel give him the interpretation. Verse 8. But at last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar. Notice how he had renamed God is my judge, Daniel, to Belteshazzar. Bel is my judge, according to the name of my God. It offended him to have to call him by Israel's God, and whose is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying. And he goes ahead and he takes and tells us the dream again. I'm not going to record that again. Daniel stood back and let everybody take their shot. It's almost like Elijah the other day. He let the prophets of Baal jump on the altar, do all the things they were doing, because he knew that God was going to take care of things. Nebuchadnezzar knew that Daniel had a, quote, magic that was greater than his own. Being an occultist, Nebuchadnezzar had familiar spirits, no doubt. But nothing like Daniel had. And so he tells Daniel the dream. And in verse 9, I want to go further down. Verse 13, he tells him the dream. And he said in verse 14, I heard him say, hew down the tree and cut off his branches. Hew, cut, same word. Shake off the leaves, scatter his fruit, get the beast. What's going on here? Verse 17. Daniel looked at the king. And I think he kind of squinted a little bit. I have a little bit of divine imagination here. And he said to him, Mr. King, you're not going to like what you're about to hear. This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand of the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. We studied Romans 13 the other day, and we saw how that even the kings are to be subject to the highest power, God himself. And that's what Daniel 4 was saying. Nebuchadnezzar, you don't answer to any man on earth, but you answer to me. And gives it to whomsoever he will. And then God takes his hand and smacks Nebuchadnezzar straight across the face and sets over it the basest of men. Nebuchadnezzar, you are nothing but a mean old bully. You are the lowest of people. You may think you're the greatest of the great. But I want you to know 2 things. Number 1, I don't think much of you. Number two, I'm the one that put you there. I'm the one that can take you down. I don't know about you, I've often wondered how men like Hitler crawl to the top and stay there. With millions of Germans running around with machine guns, tanks, Stukas, all the stuff they had, nobody could shoot Hitler and take him out of the way. That is nothing short of demonic. And God said, I put the basest of men, people who don't care about their friends, who would shoot the very people that helped them come to the top without ever thinking twice. Nebuchadnezzar, that's you. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now, thou, O Belteshazzar, Daniel, declare the interpretation. Tell me what it means, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation. I'm sure they tried. I'm sure they gave him some cock and bull story, and Nebuchadnezzar was wise enough to know, you don't know what you're talking about. Get me somebody in here who can interpret it. Finally, Daniel walks in. Thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour. That means Daniel was quiet, almost like he was in shock. His thoughts troubled him. How am I going to tell the king what the meaning of this dream is? He is not going to like it. And he has the right to chop my head off, and there's nothing I can do. His thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, Belshazzar, come on, tell me the dream. Don't let it bother you, or the interpretation thereof trouble thee, Belshazzar. Tell me the dream. My lord, the dream be to them that hate you, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. Daniel said, King, you're not going to like this dream. But here goes. You're the tree that you saw. You are the greatest king on the face of the earth. Your top reaches all the way to heaven. The whole world knows who you are. Your leaves are fair. Your kingdom's rich. Everything good is here. It's a wonderful place. Verse 22. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reaches unto heaven, and thy dominion to the ends of the earth. Whereas the king saw a watcher. Now a watcher is an angel. Nebuchadnezzar, being a pagan, wouldn't necessarily be able to say it's an angel. He just knew there was somebody there who was watching him. And a holy one coming down from heaven, same person, saying, hew the tree down, cut it down. Verse 24. Again, I'm not going to read the dream again. Look at the last part of 23. And let his portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. In the book of Daniel, a time is a year. You say, how do you know that? Because he talks about a time, and half a time. A year, 2 years, and half a year, 3.5 years. He talks about 1,260 days. That is 42 months, 3.5 years of 30-day months, lunar months. 7 years. Here comes the interpretation, O king. Hope you're ready. Verse 25. That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee to eat grass like oxen. They shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Nebuchadnezzar, God is going to humble you. You are going to lose your mind. You're going to become an animal. They're going to keep you in the backyard of the palace like a sheep, and you're going to crawl around out there, clawing the ground like a bear. You're going to be eating grass. You're going to be acting like a total imbecile. Whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, the kingdom shall be sure unto thee. You're not going to lose your kingdom. How did Daniel know that? Anybody got an idea how Daniel would know that? I'll stop there for just a second. Anybody got an idea how Daniel would know that? Who is second in the kingdom? Daniel's the prime minister. Daniel's going to hold on to the kingdom for Nebuchadnezzar. In their hierarchy, Daniel could have claimed to be the king. You know, the 25th Amendment. The king's lost his mind. I'm in charge now. The greatest magician would be the king in Babylon. Daniel's the greatest magician. Nobody can stand a chance against him. Daniel says to him, don't worry about the kingdom. I'll hold on to it for you, Nebuchadnezzar. But you need to learn a lesson. Verse 27, wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, and if it may be, a lengthening of thy tranquility. King, humble yourself now, and God won't have to humble you himself. The Bible says if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. If I recognize I'm a sinner and I come to Christ for forgiveness, then he forgives me. If I am stubborn in my sin, then God will break me down. God says if I will judge myself, then he doesn't have to judge me. If I misbehave as a pastor, if I judge myself, then God or the church doesn't have to judge me. It's just common sense. If you yield your pride and make things right, then God forgives. But if you're stubborn in your sin, God will break you. And he said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are going to be insane for 7 years. Daniel said to him, come on, king, please. Nope. 12 months go by. Verse 30. The king spake. He's walking around his palace. Is this not great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom? By the way, this explains John 14. In my Father's house are many mansions. Nebuchadnezzar looks across the great city of Babylon, 45 square miles. He looks across Babylon, a city that he has built personally. He looks at Babylon with all its palaces and he says, is this not great Babylon, the city, the capital that I have built for the house of the kingdom? So that heaven is my Father's house of the kingdom, and in it are many mansions and palaces. The idea that people say, well, in my Father's house are many apartments, just doesn't cut it. In my Father's house are many mansions. Why? Because it's the capital of the universe. It is the pride of God himself, in a good sense. Nebuchadnezzar looks over Babylon. The city of Babylon, according to Herodotus, the ancient historian, had walls that went 100 feet into the ground and 300 feet high. They were 72 feet wide at the top, and 6 chariots could race around the top of the walls side by side. The Euphrates River flowed through the middle of Babylon. Every place where the river intersected a street, there was a gate of brass so that there was no way you could come up out of the river into the city unless they wanted you to. There were palaces all over the place, but in the southern section of Babylon, there was a tower to Marduk, or Baal. Bel, not Baal, different god. The tower to Marduk rose up. There was a 60-foot statue inside, solid gold of Marduk, but on the very top, the penthouse, was a giant table made 40,000 pounds of gold, where sacrifices to Marduk were made at the top. He looks across the city where gold is on every palace and building, white stone, it's glistening in the noonday sun. Scholars said, we don't believe Nebuchadnezzar ever lived. And then they found the walls of Babylon, and on the inside of each brick is his name. What animal, Belle? Oh, okay. Hang on. We'll get there, I promise. JL's right. But on the back of each brick was Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. They say, guess he did. He had a gate of Ishtar. It was made of stone that was burned and glazed, a beautiful blue, and then there were golden lions built out of bricks that raised out of the gate, and it went up. I mean, the city was absolutely gorgeous. It was the largest, most beautiful city on the face of the earth for 200 years. And Nebuchadnezzar built it. Is this not great Babylon, which I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? God said, how dare you, that you might know that the Most High rules in the affairs of men. Verse 31. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and just like the prophecy was, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and he did eat grass as oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Doesn't say he turned into an animal, just that he was out in the weather until his nails grew, his hair grew, and next thing you know, he just looked like a beast. He crawled around the backyard of the palace for 7 long years. 7 long years. Yeah, sure sounds like one, doesn't it? 7 long years. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned unto me. Once Nebuchadnezzar finally said, enough's enough. We read about the prodigal son. When he came to himself, he said, don't my father's servants have plenty to eat? We could go to Samson. We could go to others. Sin always drives people insane. Pride drives them most quickly. It is the arrogance of men that makes them think that they don't need God. I just read an article, was in the paper the other day, that the first person to live to be 1,000 years old is alive on the earth today. That scientists now know how to go in and alter DNA so that it won't get old and we can live forever and everybody's going to be happy and it's going to be wonderful. God said, in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. God said, one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. No man's ever lived 1,000 years. Adam lived 950, Noah 930, and Methuselah 969. Nobody's made it to 1,000. I don't think anybody's going to make it to 1,000 now. Nebuchadnezzar said, I lifted up my eyes to heaven. That must have been a strange experience for Nebuchadnezzar, because he looked down on everything and everybody before that. He was the king. They bowed before him. Now Nebuchadnezzar is on his hands and his knees, and he looks up to heaven. He is bowing to the God of heaven. And the minute he bowed to the heaven, my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High. And I praised and honored him that lives forever and ever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, his kingdom from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and none can stay his hand and say unto him, What doest thou? He got saved. He recognized without God he was absolutely nothing. And everything he was and everything he could ever hope to be was because of God. We don't hear the echo of Is this not great Babylon, which I have built for the majesty of the kingdom? No, this time we hear there's nobody like God. Thank God he loved me. Thank God he gave me this privilege. And at that same time, my reason returned unto me. You say, is there a record of Nebuchadnezzar having a nervous breakdown? The answer is yes, there are. If you go into the historical records of the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar, you will find there's reference. Some people say it's 3.5 years. The Bible says it was 7. I don't read Sumerian. I don't read cuneiform, so I can't correct it, and I'm not going to argue with God. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. No more the God of gods, the King of heaven, all whose works are true, his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride, he's able to abase. The greatest nervous breakdown in history. The greatest man, the most powerful human being who ever lived. The ruler of virtually every human being on earth. Broken down by God till on his face he cries out and recognizes the God of heaven. Daniel chapter 4. Father, again, we thank you for your word. Lord, we're humbled. There is not a one of us here that has anything that we did not receive at the hands of the God of heaven who loved us and watched over us. Lord, even if we're still in rebellion, all that we have came from you and from you alone. Lord, help us to recognize that. Lord, if we have gifts, talents, abilities, callings, whatever, they are nothing except the hand of a gracious God who reached out and loved us. Lord, if we have marriages that work in a world where 50% of the marriages break up in divorce, may we give thanks to God instead of to each other that he has put us and held us together. Lord, if we have a job in an economy that seems as unstable as ever, may we thank God. If we have talents that are inexplicable by human nature, music, arts, the things that we do, Father, may we understand they are simply a loan from heaven. And if we don't use them to honor you, Nebuchadnezzar didn't use his power to honor you, then you can take them away as quickly as you gave them to us. Father, may we know that the Most High rules in the affairs of men and gives it to whomsoever he wills. Amen.